And I am delighted to be here. And again, I am from the Germantown campus, as you said, and Vedum is Rockville. We're a 3-campus community college in Montgomery County. And I have to tell you, I'm delighted to be here. It's a privilege, it's an honor. And I, as you think about something like this, an hour, that's a long time to listen to somebody, and I'm not going to talk for an hour because I'd really love to have some time for some discussion. But I was thinking, I saw this thing on LinkedIn about how to give a great presentation. And one of the things it said specifically for a plenary session is, don't thank the organizers. It should be about the participants, engage the participants. But I am going to thank the organizers. So y'all know that book, First Break All the Rules. So Vedum, Kristen, I really do want to thank you. And it's really a very personal thank you because it gave me an assignment that allowed me to step out of my role as an administrator and think about something that is important and is interesting. And so I personally am very grateful, and I hope that my joy in that turns out to be somewhat beneficial for all of those of you who are in the room. There's another rule, probably an unstated rule, too obvious to state, that you shouldn't start with an apology. But I'm going to start with an apology as well. And you can take that up with Vedum and Kristen. I don't have deep expertise, vast knowledge in quantitative biology. But I hope what I will be able to share with you is where I came to this, why it's sort of on my radar, and why I believe it's so important. And really am in awe of what you all are doing, because it is a challenge. And there's a third rule that I'm going to break. I think it's a rule that you shouldn't talk too much about yourself. And I hope it's not too much, but I do want to share a little bit of my pathway, what I have done in the past, and again, why I think about this and why I wish I had more time to think about this. You're probably sitting there going, so why is she here? Why is she up there talking to us or down here? So first of all, congratulations. You're the first cohort in this grant, and that's really wonderful to develop these learning modules that will integrate quantitative skills for this teaching and understanding. And I want to talk, I know we come from different community colleges, but I think some of the challenges are the same, and one is mathematics, and I'll mention that a little bit more. What we see at Montgomery College, and again, we're just north of Washington, D.C., so it's a community I was sharing, I call us Lake Wobegon squared, maybe cubed, and that's appropriate for today. All of the children are not just above average, they're all way above average, at least in the minds of some. But the fact of the matter is, we have an incredibly diverse population, and you can define that diversity in almost any way that you like. It is racial, it is ethnic. We have students from 150 to 60 countries any given semester, so we are international, we are rich, we are poor. Our president, who is an African-American woman, is fond of saying the county is getting browner and poorer and older. I am getting older and helping to do that. But we really need to worry about those who are browner and poorer, and how do we bring them along, because those two things are intertwined. And so the opportunities of today, which we talk about our down county schools in Montgomery County, and that's where the wealthier folks tend to live. And these are kids who are off to the Ivy Leagues. Their parents work for national labs. Their parents work on Capitol Hill. They grow up in this milieu of opportunity. Their neighbors are people who are doing the same kinds of things. So how do we at the community college take these young people, and some of them are 18 young, some of them are 28 or 38, taking advantage of an opportunity for the first time. How do we make them aware of what those opportunities are? And I think that's a real part of our mission, is to engage people and open doors, open windows of opportunity, and certainly quantitative biology is one of those. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit is my introduction to interdisciplinary science came as an undergraduate more years ago than I want to admit. I was actually working with a particle physics group at Brookhaven National Laboratory between having gotten my undergraduate degree in physics and before going to graduate school, which the intention was to do that in physics at Carnegie Mellon, and they had given me, they pushed my start date out so that I could have this opportunity at Brookhaven. And I learned there of the work that was being done in tomography, specifically positron emission tomography. And for those of you who are all younger than I am, that was a new and emerging and very exciting field at one point. And that some of the work was being done at Brookhaven at the time. So I really got kind of intrigued and engaged with what was going on in that sort of intersection of physics and the life sciences, medicine at the time. The then emerging fields of biophysics, bioengineering, and biomathematics were just really very exciting to me. And I was actually with a letter which was put into an envelope that was sealed and had a stamp on it. I was actually able to move my graduate work from the physics department at Carnegie Mellon to bioengineering, and ended up there. It was pretty easy back in those days. So people had been doing biophysics and bioengineering, but in silos, and you referred to that, Lou, in traditional fields of studies. So you had a biologist, reaching out and doing something with physics or mathematics. You had a mathematician who learned about a life science, a biological problem, whatever, but again, very much siloed. And one example, and some of you, and if you haven't read this, it's really one of those sort of historic seminal works, a quantitative description of membrane current and its application to conduction and excitation in nerves by Hodgkin and Huxley at the Physiological Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, was published in 1952. That predates me, but again, clearly this link between engineering, if you will, physics, mathematics, and life sciences. So this work, it wasn't really new that, sort of 25 years later when I was being introduced to it. But bioengineering had emerged at that point, this is in the late 70s, early 80s, as a field of study. And it was a new field of study, and some of you will smile. There was a raging debate as to whether it should be an undergraduate field of study. And that debate has ended, and it now is a field of study. So anyway, I arrived with no engineering background in particular to be in this bioengineering program, but it was my math that saved me. So there was lots of engineering that I had to learn. There was one other woman, there were two girls in the department, in the program, in that class. She left after the first semester. She had a BS in in biochemistry from Mount Holyoke. So probably a good student, probably well trained in biochemistry. She didn't have the mathematics, and she didn't make it after the first semester. So that foundation in math is really critical. And as I said, it's one of the things that sort of saved me. And I landed in a biomechanics lab. Let's see if I can advance this. Working on a problem, a disease called Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease. It's a disease, it's usually called Legg-Perthes disease. It affects young boys, sort of 3 to 8 years old predominantly. Girls can get it. And the problem is, you've got your femur. For the biologists in the room, you'll know which one is the femur. For the mathematicians, it's that leg bone. And it's got this lovely head that articulates with an acetabulum. The cure, the treatment for this disease, and it's an idiopathic ischemic necrosis problem. So unknown origin, loss of vascularization, the head of the femur collapses. And so the treatment was to put these boys, these little boys, and any of you who have any relationship with a boy around the age of 5 will understand the problems here, is to put them on bed rest, basically, sort of immobilize them. And this could go on for 2 or 3 years. So not only is that difficult for the child, for the family involved, it's not good for the rest of the growth and development that's going on in a child at the time. So the idea was, you actually have a marker, to come up with a surgical technique. So you've got a load-bearing region, and if they knew where the disease, where the compromised region of the bone was, the idea was that could you take a wedge out of the shaft of the femur somewhere, options, and by bringing those 2 points together, you'd cause a rotation one way or the other. So if the region that's diseased is bearing load, could you change the position of the head of the femur so that the load was in a different spot? And if so, how big should this wedge be, and on what side, and the size of the wedge and where? And at the point that they were trying this, it was sort of trial and error, what I used to call pick and shovel surgery. I mean, an orthopedic surgeon would literally go in with a chisel and whack out a bit. So the idea was, can we quantify this? And laser surgery was coming in. Again, all these things were new at one point, things that we take for granted today. So the idea was, if you knew how big, if you knew where, and with the precision of a laser, could we quantify this process? So I got involved in this project. using finite element analysis. And you don't need to worry whether you're on the math side of the house or the biology side of the house. You don't need to worry specifically about what finite element analysis is, other than it's widely used, it's widely applicable, and you take, and these are pictures, this is work that was done many more years after I did. It's what I could find on the internet, if you will. But you take something and you chunk it up into finite elements, small pieces. And if you think about calculus a little bit, differential calculus is about taking things and slicing it and dicing it and making it small. Integral calculus is about putting it back together. So this step is the slicing and dicing. And the mathematics, that what comes in here is, and again, this is from the mechanical engineering piece, we know the equations that describe how something reacts when you, for instance, push right here, what happens down here. If you push over here, what happens in any of the other elements. So you get these models of, you've got load, and you can put those load, you can attach that wherever, and you can solve this problem, is the bottom line. I don't want to get too bogged down in all of this, but these are problems that are solved in areas like structural analysis, heat transfer, fluid flow, mass transport, and electromagnetic potential. Those are all areas that have a life science application. And students need to understand this. They need to know, even if they're not at a level where they can solve the problems, to understand that potential, not the electric potential specifically, but what is the work that's going on? Why should you connect these things? Why does a biologist need to know some mathematics? What doors, what windows of opportunity open when you can share some of this? And so, again, going back to this finite element process, the method that formulates the problem is a system of algebraic equations. So this is not particularly high level, and then you get into some differential equations and partial differential equations. So even the student, if you had a student who was really interested in something like this, they can take a pretty deep dive at a sophomore level. But even for those who aren't, to understand what some of these issues are and the problems that can be solved. So, one of the first things to do in looking at a problem is to decompose it. And then once you've done that decomposition, you've sort of figured out all the different pieces. And next step is, whose domain is that? Who should be working on that? And this is another thing that I think it's really important to share with students. It's pretty much team science these days. If you look historically, there are a lot of people who are doing some crazy things. They ended up getting Nobel Prizes for them in some cases, but they're often working in isolation. And so much work today is done in a team. So to take that problem apart and say, who's working on what part of it, that only works when where there's an intersection and people have some awareness of what the other components are, what the other domains are, if you will. So anyway, the work I did was measuring initially, because nobody knew the mechanical properties of necrotic bone, or for that matter, of healthy cancellous bone. The cancellous bone is that spongy bone. For those of you who haven't seen that, in an X-ray, you may have seen that. So the head of the orthopedics department, he would have on a particular morning of the week, he'd do a whole bunch of hip replacements, and he'd bring me the femoral heads, and he'd say, "Here, Margaret, do your math on these." And so the math was to chunk them up in those little pieces. Again, the experimental piece, have students know there is real hands-on sort of fun work still being done. And then with those measurements made with that data, put the problem together and do the analysis. So my advisor wrote the finite element program that we used. It's an off-the-shelf product now. It's like between Cheerios and popcorn. And so that's another thing. The tools that are available, you don't have to write your own finite element routine. You don't have to write a lot of routines these days, but you have to know it exists. You have to know what it can do. You have to know its capabilities. And so again, those are things I think that we need to talk to our students about, and whether it's these modules. I love the idea of these modules, and I know that the kinds of things you'll be talking about and creating are really to teach concepts that are embedded in a curriculum. But part of our job, I think, is to expose students to why. And everybody in here, I'm guessing, who teaches math has been asked, who uses this? Why do I have to know this? And I've had colleagues, and I hope that the mindset is changing, who've said to students, and have shared that they've said to students, not in a negative way, well, I don't know, I teach math. You'll figure that out in your other courses. It's my job to teach you the math. That works for some students, and there's students who are always sort of leapfrogging over certain things, but that doesn't work for a lot of students. And so if you can make some connection and say, well, I can't tell you exactly, but there's some really cool math being applied to some biology problems. The other thing that I think students need to understand, here, go back, the tools of a discipline. You know, if you there's that saying that, you know, if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a hammer, like a nail. But if you have a hammer and you're skilled with that hammer, you can put up a picture, you can build the doghouse, and that's one of our new science buildings at the Rockville campus. So there's a lot of work you can do if you know how to use that. We tend to teach in silos. We teach the work of our disciplines, the tools of our disciplines. So how do we share how broadly applicable they are? And that is one of the beauties of mathematics, is it is very broadly applicable. My first job after graduate school was actually doing space shuttle flight loads for NASA. And you might say, you came out of bioengineering and you're doing space shuttle flight loads. They saw finite element analysis on my application, and I had the job. So again, the numbers change, the coefficients in those equations when you're talking about titanium and all kinds of other things in satellite components are different than they are when you're talking about necrotic cancellous bone or healthy cancellous bone. But the fundamental equations don't change. F equals ma works whether it's a big F or a small f. You can figure out what the concomitant A is. And so again, to have students understand the power of what they're learning, the broad applicability, and that comes, and somebody talked about this, understanding a chi-square value, a p-value. Just calculating that isn't sufficient. What can you really do with that? And one of the things, quite honestly, that I think we suffer from in the classroom is these kinds of discussions and this kind of understanding takes time. And we're often in a hurry to get through curriculum. And I understand that, but I think the time spent sometimes in motivating students and having these kinds of conversations, if they are motivated, they will do the work that otherwise we're saying, well, why didn't you do your homework? You know, it's late and you're looking at a spreadsheet or something and they didn't get the work done, and it's math and they don't like the math. So as I said, I think that time spent in providing some motivation and making some connections is really valuable for students. So continuing on today, I ran across an article, again, going back to finite element and life sciences. In 2018, finite element analysis of biological soft tissues surrounded by a deformable membrane that controls transmembrane flow. So again, it's still being put to good use. And one of my favorites was the investigation into the mechanical properties of very soft tissue which do not bear mechanical loads, such as the brain, liver, kidney. Because, anybody want to take a guess why we care about the mechanical properties of things like the brain that don't bear load? Pretty much sheltered by your skull. Not a lot of load bearing there, even if you're doing this. We've witnessed a rapid advance in various robotics techniques relevant to medical applications. New automatic surgical tools and robots, as well as virtual reality techniques, have created a need for accurate soft tissue and organ models. And so this is being done in the brain. This actually was a review of the finite element model in head injuries. But anyway, so this is now a decades old, and yes, decades, a decades old technique still being used widely in ways that I guarantee you 30, 40 years ago when it was being developed, nobody anticipated that this kind of application. But that, again, that foundational relationships, those are there, and people continue to find ways to use this and apply it. So should freshmen and sophomores be doing finite element analysis? Maybe not, although you might be able to find some really cool applications, download software. But might they have an understanding of one way that a set of problems can be approached exists? I would argue yes. And again, I'm a big believer in that you plant these seeds, you get these dots out there, and the network, that node that this group is, and it isn't always clear when and where a connection will be made. But I think we could probably survey this group, and certainly our students who have graduated and gone forward. We use things, we come back and connect to things, seeds that were planted, and sometimes people will tell you a teacher in a particular course said something, or they learned something in a particular course. So again, this is about opening those doors and windows of opportunity. There's a famous essay that appeared in 2004, Mathematics is Biology's Next Microscope, Only Better. Biology is Mathematics' Next Physics, Only Better. And author Joel Cohen talks broadly about mathematics being interpreted as a more general microscope, and it can reveal otherwise invisible worlds in all kinds of data, not only optics. So again, it's that use of mathematics as a tool, as a microscope, letting you look. We would not want to produce a biology student who's not familiar with a microscope, and we shouldn't be producing biology students who aren't familiar with mathematics and what they can do, what they can image with that. Mathematicians, I will tell you, often don't like to think of their field as a toolkit. They are enthralled by the beauty of the subject. They describe it in terms of elegance, simplicity, the harmony of numbers and forms, of geometric elegance, stern perfection was one of my favorites. Truth, mathematics doesn't lie. And that's all great, but for scientists and engineers, the beauty lies in the application, in the ability of mathematics to describe precisely, to model, to predict. In the 17th century, so this isn't an old idea, Galileo famously stated that our universe is a grand book written in the language of mathematics. And more recently, the Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner argued that the, quote, unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences demanded an explanation. So, again, I'm not sure that many of our students will marvel at some of those statements, but again, there's a long history of that, and I think too to help them understand that people have marveled at this, and it is interesting that this language that helps us to do so much, to understand so much, to describe so much, to then be able to manipulate and use and predict so much is really important. And it is that idea of a language. You know, I often think we talk about the language of music, we talk about the language of mathematics. How many of you play an instrument or sing or have any musical background? Y'all hum a tune? Okay. So imagine if you were going to play a Beethoven quartet, a pop song, and you had to say, okay, so you're going to start at a frequency of 440 and hold that for 1/10 of a second, while you are going to be at a frequency of 510 and holding that for some period of time, and then you're going to transition. There would be no music that was transcribed. And so there is a language, and it's staff lines, and it's dots, and people can communicate in that language. And nobody balks at that. Nobody thinks that it is odd that there is this way of communicating about music that's really a different language, and that's really all mathematics is. We use A, B, C, D's, E's, and F's because they were convenient, or alphas and omegas and lambdas and pi's. It's convenient, but the equation part, the punctuation, if you will, the grammar of it is what's different and seems unfamiliar. And I feel badly that we let students get so far thinking that it's odd, that it's hard. If we could get them earlier thinking it's just a different way of communicating, and it's a very convenient and often shorthand way of communicating things that otherwise would be very tedious. And again, because it allows us to do something with it, it allows us to do that manipulation that can become so important. So throughout the year, again, let me go forward here. We teach in silos, beautiful silos. I love this picture because biology is a beautiful subject, mathematics is a beautiful subject, philosophy is a beautiful subject. And unfortunately, that tends to be the way that we teach. And how do we move away from this? How do we, poke some holes in that, build some bridges? And that's really what I see all of you doing through this project, and I applaud you for that. So going on, just again, sort of my transgression, if you will, or the journey going forward. We had this discussion at Montgomery College, and this was a few years ago. Vedam, I don't remember if you were there when we were hearing from, and again, I was in the math department at the time. We'd hear from faculty across the college. The students can't do the math. What are you teaching? They can't do this. They can't do that. We have a professional week before each semester. It's before classes started and faculty get together. It's really the only time of the year that we can get people within departments across the campuses, across disciplines together. So one year we had representatives from the math department meet with representatives from other departments, from biology, chemistry, and literally the social sciences as well, and said, what math do you need your students to know? What is it that they can't do that you are accusing us of not teaching? And what we really found out is the math department is teaching the content, but from the perspective of mathematicians, and students don't recognize it. So if you've been taught that a ratio is the quantitative relation between two amounts showing the number of times one value contains or is contained within another, or that it is the relationship between two measures expressed as the number of times one bigger or smaller than the other, or that it is expressed by the quotient of the division of the first by the second, or of A to B, then when the biology student is hearing about ratios and you're talking about genetic crosses, phenotypes, and probability, there's a real disconnect. And I can't remember, Claudia, was it you who mentioned the need for common language? Somebody said that this morning. And so part of that, I think, is one of the things we need to address. What's the common language? If a ratio in a math class looks like all that sort of incomprehensible stuff and makes it hard to solve a homework problem, how are we expecting students to then recognize that in another class and really understand it? Not just that it's one number on top of another number, but what really does that represent? And can we find a common language and a common way of approaching that? And I'm very excited to share that I think it's a chemistry faculty member and one of our Calculus 2 faculty members are guest lecturing in each other's classes this year. And that's a really nice way to start that. These are not cross-listed courses. It's not a learning community. Sometimes those things make it hard. There's scheduling issues and that sort of thing. This is just, the students are going to see somebody walk into a math class and hear from a chemist and vice versa. And I think sometimes if we can get those kinds of things going, it's good for faculty, it's good for the people teaching, but it's also great for the students. So I'm very excited to know that that's going on. So a next step for me, I'm not fast forwarding here. So again, these are the kinds of things that students are seeing in biology classes. A student at a pre-calculus level should be able to manipulate, use, and understand these equations. Can they? In your experience, I'm seeing people's heads no. And again, why is that? There's no content there. And again, I'm saying pre-calculus, assuming they've had a little bit of trigonometry. So how do we help them in the math class? And is this a module? How do we take this apart? I have dealt with a couple of students over the years where we typically talk about linear equations in terms of y equals mx plus b. You change any one of those variables or letters representing it, and they go, but where's m? I can't solve it for z. Where's y? And that is a failure on the part. I'm going to throw this at the math faculty and probably really at the middle school and high school level, to help students really understand and take ownership of what that alphabet soup is. Isn't math about numbers? And we've thrown all these letters in, so what do they mean? And to help students take, at the 8th grade level, at the 9th grade level, to really understand that, yeah, we can swap out those letters. That's sort of irrelevant. Why is there a P and a V here? I'm used to X's and Y's in my math equations. Well, if we help them in math classes understand that those usually will stand for real physical quantities, it starts to make more sense over time, that the others are sort of placeholders. Now, for the mathematicians who like the beauty and elegance and simplicity, that sort of common y equals mx plus b may have some appeal. Most of our students will not go on to be math majors. And I argue that even those who do see the beauty and elegance and love the mathematics, they may be slightly perturbed by the application, but they'll get over it, and they will go on and pursue when they transfer at that junior, senior level, graduate student, and they'll say, oh yeah, I remember when they talked about that stuff. It just was not interesting to me. And I've talked to people who started in physics and pivoted to mathematics. So it does happen. And this gets me, well, let me talk first about another thing, and I'll come back to this. So one of the things that I did, and this is where I really sort of took a deeper dive into being passionate about this. In 2012, I wrote an STEM grant actually with a couple of colleagues, and it was called, we named it On Ramp to STEM, and the ramp was retention and achievement through mathematical prowess. So the overarching goal of On-Ramp was to provide access to quantitative biology, to the quantitative biology superhighway by introducing students to and piquing their interest and curiosity about the mathematical biological links, a missing link for many students in these disciplines. The ability to measure and model in order to understand and manipulate biological processes is at the forefront of research and workforce demands. And that was, I took that right out of the grant. My elevator pitch at the time, and really sort of still is, that a science student who loves math really is likely to head towards physics. A science student who can tolerate math, put up with it, may become a chemistry major. But the science student who is fleeing math, the math phobic, headed towards biology. And I've had some faculty at Montgomery College, not Vedum, but I have had colleagues say, that was me. And I've been at conferences where, again, biologists, and these are people with graduate degrees, say, oh yeah, that was me, it's the math. If it's beyond algebra, I'm not doing it. And so there are too many members of the community who are members of what I call the math-phobic biology club. And that's what we really need to work on changing. And again, you don't have to be math-philic necessarily. You don't have to double major. But the phobia is going to interfere. So my motivation in writing the grant, in part, was recognizing that biology is no longer a safe haven for the future scientists fleeing quantitative disciplines. And quite frankly, we can't afford to lose those people. If we have students who really want to do science, who are passionate about biology, about the life sciences, we don't want to turn them away because we say to them, you've really got to master some math at this point. So we need to figure out a better way of merging these fields, of helping the biology student understand how and why mathematics is useful. And hopefully by seeing that, they'll do that deep dive of mastery and become more competent and maybe even enjoy it. When I started working on this grant, I started to use the phrase computational biology, but it was already a well-defined field. I used to joke that you could put the word computational in front of any subject and you would find an emerged field. But that really isn't a joke. You can today get a PhD in computational sociology, in computational economics. You can also study computational anatomy, neuroscience, genetics or genomics, pharmacology, ecology, evolutionary biology, biomodeling, bioneuropsychiatry, and cancer computational biology. Those are all words in which you can stick computation in front of it and earn a degree. There are programs in the country. So not all of our students will go on to get a PhD. Not all of them want to. Not all of them will be capable of it. And some, again, at the community colleges, we launch students who transfer and will go on to do that. But we also have students who take that 2-year degree, or at Montgomery College, we have a biotech program. They may get a certification, an AAS degree, something and really head right for the workforce. But the quantitative piece of that is still important, and we need to make sure that they're getting that foundation. We can't, if a student has had no foundation laid, has not built any of those, put any of those pieces into place, and as a senior in college decides that that's a field they'd like to pursue, there's a lot of catch-up that they have to do. And not that, who was talking about the Filipino banana ketchup, not that kind of ketchup. But that's part of the problem, is there's that building, that scaffolding in mathematics where you really have to start at the beginning and work sequentially. It's very difficult to say, gee, I've never taken any math, but I'd like to take that course in linear algebra and learn something about matrices. It just doesn't work that way. And so to give students at the beginning, as they're working their way to whatever they'll end up doing, some of these skills on which they can build. Again, when I was in the classroom, I used to tease students who'd say, you know, I'm never going to use this. I'd say, well, A, you don't know that, and B, you can be buried with a full brain at no extra charge. So fill it up, and then use it. Again, those dots are out there, and if they're out there and you can reach for them, it's kind of like being able to reach for the stars. So anyway, again, kind of motivating that, the students to take that deeper dive and struggle to understand something. So part of what I did too, and again, I sort of enjoyed this exercise. I asked some faculty colleagues, both in biology and biotech, and I said, where are the weaknesses? What do you hear, what are you seeing in your classrooms, and what do you hear? And again, in particular, our biotechnology folks tend to work very closely with people in industry. By the way, in Montgomery County, we have about 250 biotech companies. So it's a big sector of our economy. We do send students into that workforce, and it is at the associate's degree level. Some go on and get their bachelor's, master's, whatever, but we send many students in at that entry level. And so this is the feedback I got. You know, what were the gaps? I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'll come back to that. So one said, they're the very basic things. They don't associate numbers with physical observations. And he added, and this is at the associate's and the PhD level. He said, for example, they have no mental estimation, no idea of the ballpark figure for an arithmetic operation. They do not compare their calculator display with their mental display. And he said some of them don't have that mental display. They do not, they do not connect a physical amount with a number. What should 10 grams of sodium chloride look like? I now show them on the first day of lab what 1 microliter, 1 milliliter, 100 milliliters, and 1 liter look like. Same for grams, 1 milligram, 1 gram, 100 grams, and 1 kilogram. So again, that's a relatively easy thing to do. They struggle with significant figures. That's certainly a place for a module, and I was going to see heads nodding. I've heard this for years. That's good work for a module, and maybe a fun module. It's also work that can be done in the math class as well as in a biology class, and again, have students see that application when you're talking about powers of numbers. They need more conceptual understanding, from rounding to estimating to the logic of Fermi estimates, back of the envelope calculations that estimate complex problems. They're weak in transitioning algebra and calculus 1 and 2 concepts into actual science applications. And then the big sigh was dimensional analysis. and I heard that from several people. So again, treating units like algebra. And I am not ashamed to admit that I got through more than a few problems doing the dimensional analysis, sort of figuring out how to set the problem up and then going back and figuring out why it worked that way. Again, a module, is there a module here? They need more applied examples besides the basic growth curve for bacteria. Tracking the increase in the number of cases of the coronavirus and modeling is a perfect example, and predicting mutation rates. I'm going to push back a little on the coding experience. Any coding experience is good experience. They should be able to code from Excel to R to Python or C++. And one person commented that many students, we assume they have good Microsoft skills because it's been out for so long and everybody's on their devices, but many of them don't. And so to sort of do that check, and maybe that isn't something to be taught in a math class or in a biology class, but if the students are weak there, are there resources at the college that can help students develop those kinds of skills? And I'll share in terms of the coding, and again, we are fortunate to live in the backyard of NIST, of NIH, of FDA, so we have students who get some pretty fantastic opportunities because of these national labs, and one is through a grant opportunity. We send 16 students a year to NIST. And they work with a research group, and then they have to do a presentation. They are now required to have some coding experience. It was not on the description many years ago, and then it was optional. It was a preferred kind of a thing, and now they're asking students to have some coding experience. So again, how can they get that? Modules, maybe one module isn't enough. We're actually talking at the college, can we create one credit classes? I'm guessing you all face the same issues that we do in terms of transferability. If a course doesn't transfer, if it's not part of their program, 2/3 of our students are Pell eligible. Pell won't fund something that's not in a program. So here we are encouraging them, even if it's not in your major, take a statistics course, you won't regret it. Even if it's not in your major, take a coding class, you won't regret it. But they can't get financial aid for that. So there are obstacles there, and then they often don't transfer. And so we sometimes, I think, at the community colleges, because of our agility, are ahead of what a 4-year school can do. They're still sort of back there in the good old days. And so we've come up with something really creative, innovative that's working, but again, it's not transferable. And so it's a hard sell to get students to take that when it's out-of-pocket money, or it's time, because it doesn't transfer. But anyway, coding came up in several cases. And the other, and again, this goes to awareness, not necessarily what students would be doing, is DOE, and that's not Department of Energy. It's the design of experiments, how to statistically design interpretable experiments in which several variables are changed simultaneously. DOE is defined as a branch of applied statistics that deals with planning, conducting, analyzing, and interpreting controlled tests to evaluate the factors that control the value of a parameter or group of parameters. I'm not expecting even our good sophomore level students necessarily to do the deep dive into that. But is there a way, a module, a discussion in class around a lab, to help students understand experimental design? We have an adjunct who works at formerly MedImmune, now AstraZeneca, and I ran into her in the hallway, this was a couple of years ago, and she was sort of frustrated and flustered, and I said, uh-oh, what's going on? And she said, oh, we're hiring, and she said, I just need somebody who can design an experiment. And you step back from that, and I'm sure the biologists here are saying, that's not a trivial task. So again, is there a way in freshman, our Biology 150, a 200-level biology course, is there a way as students are being read into that kind of an exercise to give them some understanding of how and why is this experiment designed? Not just, and I know there's great effort to move away from certainly what I had, those cookbook labs where you open it up, step one, put the cursor here, turn on this, do this, and then, you carefully took your data and wrote something up, and often not a lot of discussion or understanding of the what and why. So I think any time we can incorporate that, and the mathematics becomes a part of that, what data, how are you going to analyze it, and to maybe use those words so that students know, again, design of experiments is a real thing. It's something that if you can do that or are interested in it, it's an opportunity out there. Quality control was another issue that came up, and using lab equipment. It no longer requires one to know, say, calculus to analyze the data. The equipment will crunch the numbers most of the time, but a person who has no idea what that means does not know what they don't know, and that can be dangerous. It's good to have an awareness, if not an understanding, of what that black box is doing for you. Back to how much math do you really need to know? Finite element analysis. Do you have to be able to write that program? No. But what's the black box doing? How does it work? And so if you're going to use it, you're using it well, and not making errors because of misapplication. Another thing that has come up at the college, I assume you all have general education requirements, some basic core set of courses. Our general education courses, one of the ways that a course gets onto that list, and the discipline has to apply for that, is that it introduces students to the thinking of a discipline. And that can be economics, it can be English, it can be math, it can be biology. And I'm never sure how exactly that's happening. In the last year, starting last fall, we've had some interesting discussions that started with, we have a STEM librarian who comes to my STEM unit leadership team, and he shared that he sees students who come to the library and they've got some kind of an assignment, research, and he's working with them, and he said, they don't know what research is. And that raised a few eyebrows in the room, and it probably shouldn't have. because I'm not sure when we talk to students about what research is. And so it's led to a discussion, and again, under me is the Germantown campus, but also the STEM unit. So we have people from across the STEM disciplines in the room. And we said, when in a mathematics course do we talk about one of the things that distinguishes mathematics from other disciplines is the notion of proof. It's the only discipline that proves things, and it's, quite frankly, one of the things mathematicians love. When do we talk about science being about investigation, about research? But there's theoretical research, there's laboratory research. What does that look like, and what do you have to know to do that? And then the engineers, yeah, that proof stuff is nice, and that investigation stuff is nice, but what can I do with it? How can I apply it? Can I build that better mousetrap? And quite honestly, I think if students understood some of those differences, it might help them think about what they want to do. We have a kind of a cool poster that shows the sort of this circle that represents all the knowledge in the world, and there's a little blip sticking out, a little pimple that is a PhD, and it pushes that circumference out, again, to help students understand what degrees are. We have students who don't understand that progression of associates, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And our president, Dr. Pollard, has told the story of getting to college and telling her advisor that she was going to get her PhD and then her master's. Isn't that the top? And so she, again, and that's not unusual to have students not know and understand some of these very fundamental things about our disciplines, about how they're going to navigate academia. So to have these kinds of conversations, and they can sometimes, I think, be interwoven in the course of a lecture, a discussion, an advising moment. It's not necessarily that we need a separate class, but how do we weave these things into the conversation so that students over time pick up on these things and start to put together this sort of puzzle, and on that puzzle, through that puzzle, is their journey, and they can start to lay out those some of that. So I'm trying to keep my eye on the time, and I do want to have time to answer questions, to ask questions, because one of the things I meant to say at the beginning is I want to know what somebody like me, somebody in my position, what can an administrator do to support what you're doing? So as I said, I'll wrap up a little quickly, but one of the things I wanted to share, and it was an article, a 2014 article in the Molecular Biology of the Cell, and it started out, it was sort of almost like a blog post, if you will. What does a mathematician looking at bacterial division under the microscope have in common with a biologist looking at stochastic simulation of microtubule growth? Both can be found at the physiology course at the Marine Biological Laboratory, MBL, in Woods Hole, which brings together graduate students and young postdocs who have a passion for quantitative biology. Students entering the course with a wide array of scientific backgrounds, including chemistry, molecular biology, and mathematics, then theoretical physics. Although at first hesitant to step outside their comfort zone, students leave the course confident and courageous in their abilities to work across traditional academic boundaries. Now, these are graduate students, these are postdocs. They are well beyond where our students are. But can we think about ways to help our students take that hesitant step rather than having to wait until they're a graduate student, to take that now, to bring that passion that was written about in this article and get the conversation going, get some activities going so that students really see that interdisciplinary nature. One of the observations made was that we strongly believe that, and again, the same article, we strongly believe that quantitative approaches not only aid in better addressing existing biological questions, but also enable the formulation of new ones. And that's a powerful observation. That's a powerful thing for students to understand, too, is where do these new observations, these new ideas come from? So I had, and I'm going to stop, I had fun doing some of the research for this, and I'm going to save you pages and pages and pages here. But one of the things they talked about, and this sort of goes back, and this was the same article, they talked about students purifying proteins, programming in MATLAB, and building microscopes. We teach MATLAB in our freshman and sophomore level math classes and engineering classes. So again, this is a well-known and used tool why aren't we introducing it if there's an appropriate way to bring it into a biology lab, to a biology course? And again, it gets that little bit of programming in, and it gets students thinking about something in a different way. And that's really a lot of the focus here, is how do we get students thinking about traditional problems outside of the traditional approaches of one discipline, and to incorporate the approaches of another discipline. The lots of stuff being thought about in terms of, again, that modeling, the generation of models and theories, collecting empirical data, modeling data, analysis of data, experimental controls. These are all seeds to plant and water and maybe see them sprout. But remember, our students are at the beginning of a journey when we see them. They have lots ahead of them. UDC Dornsife has a new undergraduate degree in quantitative biology. Some of you may be familiar with that, QBio. It's one of the first of the kind in the country, and it's using computer algorithms, mathematics, and critical thinking to find meaning in the large amounts of data generated in biological experiments. So again, this is now a degree that students will be able to go from a community college and pursue that. I will end with a little bit of data that I pulled, because we talk about jobs and students getting jobs. And again, keep in mind, Montgomery County is a rich area for the life sciences. We often laugh that Maryland, Montgomery County focus on the life sciences. You cross the river into Virginia and they focus on the death sciences. Lots of DoD stuff happening there. And with HQ2, with Amazon headquarters coming in, who knows what all of that will mean. But I did ask a colleague who does a lot of this kind of research to look at jobs. Are jobs being posted in the biological sciences and life sciences where specifically their students are being, or an applicant is being asked about quantitative skills? So in the last year, between January 2019 and January 2020, there were 11,542 job postings in life and biological sciences within a 50-mile radius of Montgomery College. Probably Vedum's campus. It was probably Rockville. I'm sorry. There were 24,786 job postings in that area. Those 11,542 specifically required some mathematics and analytical knowledge. That was in the ad, in the posting. I'm guessing that's 47%, and I'm guessing it's actually higher than that if you consider the fact that many jobs like this, there's going to be an assumption about what people know. And so analytical skills, basic mathematics may not be listed. So certainly if we look at just our geographic region, there's a real imperative that we have students be well prepared. And that's really what this is all about, is are we preparing our students for the future? Are we preparing them for now? And part of that preparation has to be that we're loading them up, if you will, with the quantitative skills. For us not to prepare biological science majors for this reality leaves them ill-equipped and unprepared to work in their chosen field, and probably to advance in that chosen field if they don't have a strong background to build on. So it's the urgency and the magnitude of the challenge, it's a wonderful problem to have, to look through a new lens to see a field of study revealed, understood in ways that was impossible not too long ago. And I'm going to end there, and I welcome any questions. And as I said, I would love to know about your experiences. And I said, what can administrators do? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So that was fantastic. And
that was Woods Hole, by the way.
Two questions. First of all, now I'm worried what pages I missed. So would you be willing to share the rest of your speech?
Yes.
I would like to know what was on the pages that you didn't
Sure.
get to. We were talking before you started today about a situation that's developed at a school near me where the math faculty is in contention with their board because the board is upset that they have raised the bar on their cut scores for entry into their program so high that the local high school students can no longer qualify for the dual enrollment program at this college.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you could share what your thoughts would be on the idea of whether we raise the bar or we lower the bar with those cut scores. I think there's strong arguments to be made for both ends of that, and I would be super interested to hear with your experience what you think the answer is.
Sure. Let me tell you a little bit, because we've had that same discussion, and let me tell you where we've landed in Montgomery County. We used to use Accuplacer. The state said there were two. We could use Accuplacer or Compass. I'm guessing most of you are probably familiar with those options. So we used Accuplacer. And cut scores varied a little bit. And we actually had someone in the math department who used to do the analysis and look at how successful students were. And based on that, we raised and lowered scores by a point or two over several years on occasion. The state is obviously interested in moving more students more quickly into programs, and we had a huge number of students. I mean, half of our students were in developmental math, and they swirled there. And we went to sort of the Emporium model. Again, Virginia Tech is 4 years, but that idea of students coming in and working independently, self-paced mastery learning, that was a fabulous opportunity for 7% of the students. I mean, they would blow through the curriculum like this. What would have been 3 semesters of developmental math for them, they did in 1, and they moved on. For the majority, they swirled. They could repeat. We had an H grade to indicate you'd gotten halfway. I mean, we did all kinds of stuff to try to make this work. Yeah, an M grade, an H grade, yes, yeah. And it was not benefiting students. So the math faculty in the last year, 18 months, Mike, is that about the right timeline, redesigned math. A couple of things happened. Before that even, we decided we did a pilot. We admitted students who had earned an A or a B in Algebra 2, and it had to be within the last year. They couldn't sit on that. And there was great consternation about this, and we said, we'll try it, we'll pilot it. And we first, it was optional. They had to opt in. So you get kind of a self-selected group. They did fabulously. There were no issues that we needed to open this up, and we did, and students did very well. We've now, by state mandate, students who have a 3.0 or better can go into college level courses, and it's a 3.0 general GPA. It's not their math GPA, it's not their English GPA. And so we are looking at that data. To accommodate that, we have taken several of our foundation math courses, statistics being one, and then there's a finite math course, that kind of survey course, where we've taken them from 3 credits to 5 credits. Those 2 additional credits really are developmental math, but it's a continuum, so they don't have to they do have to finish the 1, but it's not in separate semesters. And so far, the success rates have been tremendous. And I think it is a combination of how teachers are approaching this, and also it's very discouraging for a high school student to come in and find that, they've taken Algebra 2, maybe they've taken pre-calculus, and we're telling them, no, you really need to start at an Algebra 1 level, and you've got 3 semesters or 2 semesters before we're going to let you take a college level math course. And those are the students who don't finish. And so far, we have seen, the Accuplacer scores have not changed, but the access, and these are the foundation, not necessarily the STEM students who are coming in, but because we'd sort of been monitoring those Accuplacer scores, the students who have gone into courses based on those, or their Algebra 2, their A or B in Algebra 2, have been successful. I would say, what's the data showing? And then where is the disconnect? I understand that tension, and people really kind of hunker down and dig in. But the other thing I think to ask is, how is the math being taught? And I don't have my cell phone with me, but we all carry around something like this that can solve a problem. And again, one of the things I really think we need to help our students understand is access to information, to facts, is not knowledge. You can ask Siri something, but she didn't know what question to ask. She didn't come up with the question. And if you can't explain it, again, back to the p and the chi-square and stuff, if all you can do is calculate that. So what is being taught? Are we asking calculus students to take a derivative, find an integral, and then spend 3 pages simplifying it? Probably not a good use of their time these days. Take the integral, yes. Take the derivative. Understand why. What does that mean? What is that rate of change? We talk in X's and Y's, and it sort of doesn't mean anything. It's like if you're fans of The Sound of Music and that, do, re, mi, but it doesn't mean anything until you make a song out of it. So I think I would look at curriculum, what's being taught and why, where are students not succeeding, and can that be fixed within the content of a course with some just-in-time mathematics? That's often very successful. I think you're going to lose students, quite honestly. If the bar gets put here, they're discouraged. And there's so much content that is still accessible. If the right mathematics is at the right time. So I'm equivocating a little without knowing more information, but just raising the bar is often not the solution. I mean, if they're just looking for talented math majors, it might be, but presumably they're not only looking for talented math majors, that it's about making this content accessible to students who need to use it, who need to understand it and apply it in other fields.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I don't
Yeah.
know that we have good data on whether AccuPlacer
Okay.
accurately predicts for success in math. I really don't.
But if you
I know
look,
that prior grades
do,
so it's
yes.
refreshing to hear
Yes,
that
we're-
prior grades now predicts greater or more precisely for success than does ACT,
Yeah.
SAT, AccuPlacer, math testing, any of the standardized tests.
Exactly. And some of it is, again, because students don't live in the math world. If they've been out of school, out of a math course, they walk in, they sit down, they take that AccuPlacer test in an afternoon. They may or may not understand that this is a high-stakes test. So they do it and see what happens. But the other thing is, and again, those of you who teach, let's say pre-calculus, so students have been through some algebra, have you had the experience where you say something about, so if we want to factor a binomial, and students go, what? Never heard of a binomial. Am I in the right class? And then you write y equals, a squared plus ax squared plus bx plus c. And oh, yeah, I know how to do that. And there's a lot of that, I think, until students have seen things enough times. And there's some debate, I think, in the world of education as to how many times someone needs to see or hear or do something to really take ownership of that knowledge. But I always used to worry with tests like AccuPlacer that we also lose students who, or the score goes down because students do know how to do this if they had a very quick review. And I used to tell when I hired both full and part-time faculty, I don't ever want to hear you say to a student, and not that I'm eavesdropping, you should know that. If I had a nickel for everything I should know, I'd be on my yacht somewhere. And students forget things, we all forget things, and so sometimes just to slip in that sort of just in time, just in case you forgot, okay, and so build up to, and just move on, it's not a big deal. And often the time it takes to sort of scold a student, well, I'm not answering that, you should know that, you could have just answered the question. And so there's some things like that I hope we're not seeing as much of in kind of an old school, that sink or swim, calculus is the course where we knock them out, and that whole idea of it being a feeder course as opposed to a weeder course, and that was sort of what the Harvard calculus reform was about. Calculus was viewed, and I talked to someone from Ohio State many, many years ago who said everybody came in and took Calculus 1 to get rid of 50% of the freshman class because it was open enrollment back in the day. That doesn't say much for a lot of things. and so how does that, if calculus is important, and by the way, if you have not read, I should have brought, I don't know how many you are, if I could have, I would have brought 30 copies of Infinite Powers, Stephen Strogatz's new book. It's about calculus, and they're all of like 10 equations and graphs in it. He tells a story, and he has some wonderful, and that's some of what I didn't share, some wonderful examples of biology. Read it to your students. Have a story hour. But again, why is it important? It is so important. So I would look, if based on AccuPlacer scores, how do students do in courses if that's their first course? Are they passing? And then is that the issue, or is there a different issue that needs to be solved? Sorry. Yep. I think
That book sounds really interesting, and we'll get it put up in the collections so that you can all find it.
All right. Undo myself.
Yeah, we'll take care of that in a second. So let's thank Margaret for joining us today.